Welcome back, everyone. The goal of development finance is to create positive impact, creating jobs and improving lives. As we just saw in the video from Norfund's Investee Miniplast in Ghana, investments can also help reduce negative impact, like that of plastic pollution. However, historically, economic development has also come with many environmental challenges. To address the climate crisis, we must not only promote growth to alleviate poverty, but also ensure that it's decoupled from emissions. How to handle this challenge is a very complex topic. And I'm glad to introduce the moderator of our next panel, Karoline Teien Blystad, Senior Manager, Climate and Impact in Norfund.
So setting a net zero portfolio target, can it get in the way of development? How can we drive transition in challenging and high-emitting sectors? These are some important and challenging questions that I'm excited to discuss in the panel shortly. But first, I'm going to do a little detour to get some context for this topic. I'm going to share some of the thought process and the questions that we had to ask ourselves at Norfund when we embarked on our net zero journey. In 2020, all the EDFIs agreed to commit to a net zero portfolio emission goal by 2050, along with many other investors, some regretting it perhaps more than others. And this global goal is really important to us. It's important because climate change can easily wipe out all the gains that we made in development, and it is already doing that. And it's therefore challenging whether we at Norfund can deliver on our mandate. We also believe that operating in line with the Paris Agreement will make our investees more resilient and more successful. So it's not an option to not do anything in this area. And then comes the but. I mean, so far so good, climate, development, perfectly aligned. So we decided to make a net zero strategy, and we quickly bumped into some dilemmas. We have to take in the market context. I mean, we are an investor investing in developing countries, and if we are to reach the sustainable development goals in these countries, it requires significant growth, as we just heard from Paddy Carter. And it's hard to imagine that growth completely without any increase in emissions. Even though we wish that was true, we're not there. So how do we balance this growth, this needed growth, with the climate goals? I mean, we're going to need cement, we're going to need transport, we're going to need steel, manufacturing, and all that. It's all emission-driven. So we had to think then at our own portfolio. Is it important to us that our own investment portfolio is lowering its emissions from the offsets? And if so, should we then exit all high-emitting assets? Or should we then accept that emissions in the portfolio will increase in the short to medium term because we want to make those investments in hard-to-abate sectors that are key to development? That was some of the difficult questions that we have dealt with, and we have discussed them quite extensively, both at the board and the management team and in the organization. So what we did is that we decided on some key principles that underpinned the approach. So the first one being real economy decarbonization. It has to be real economy decarbonization through emission reductions of companies in the portfolio, rather than reducing portfolio emissions by exiting high emitters. We don't think that you can or should do net zero only through divesting. I mean, you can't divest your way to net zero, basically. The second important principle that we discussed was just transition. The transition needs to be just and inclusive, and that's a lot of words. You've all heard that phrase many times. But to us, that means that we should invest in sectors that are key to development, including those hard-to-abate sectors with potentially high emissions, with the aim of decarbonizing those over time. So in essence then, we focus more on the role that Norfund should play in the world's transition to net zero, and how we can invest in the solutions, and less about optimizing our own portfolio to be net zero. So some think that we're unambitious, some think that we're too ambitious, brave, not brave. I'm not sure. We'll see. In the panel, we'll get more to it. We will go mainly into 3 topics. First one being pitfalls of net zero strategies and whether there is a trade-off between climate and development. Then we'll dive into some more in-practice dilemmas that we meet when we talk about electrification. And lastly, how can investors drive change in high-emitting companies? And with me on stage, I would like to invite, I should say, Ifeoma Dike. She's head of ESG at Cross Boundary. And we have Clara Barby, who's a senior partner at Just Climate. So please give them a warm welcome onto the stage. Thank you. So, Ifeoma, you are head of ESG, as I said, at Cross Boundary Energy, who's one of Norfund's investees. And Cross Boundary Energy is the leading developer, owner, and operator of distributed renewable energy solutions for businesses. And Clara, you are senior partner at Just Climate, an investment fund established by Generation Investment Management. So basically, we have an investor based in London here, and then we have an investee based in Lagos there. So I think that should bring some different perspectives into the conversation. But what you do have in common is that you both want to contribute to decarbonization. That's sort of your mission. But I mean, you can perhaps say a few more words about what you do in practice when we get to it. So I'd like to kick this conversation off with a discussion on pitfalls of net zero strategies. So one pitfall that I already alluded to in the introduction is being so focused, and I'm maybe exaggerating a little bit, but that you're so focused on getting your investment portfolio down to zero, that perhaps you've committed to an annual reduction of the emissions in the portfolio, that you cannot touch anything that has high emissions. You cannot invest in any sectors that are key to development and key to the transition, basically. So starting with Clara, I mean, you represent a different kind of investor than a DFI, but can you recognize this pitfall? And it's okay if you say a few words about what Just Climate does.
Yeah, so I definitely recognize the pitfall. We are a different kind of investor, but interestingly, very mission aligned. So we're a private sector investor with a very clear mission, and that's to direct and scale institutional capital, so pension funds, sovereign wealths, endowments, large family offices, to direct and scale their capital to solutions that can deliver outsized abatement and attractive financial returns. So we're climate-led. Mm-hmm. And the reason there are pitfalls is I think the term transition finance, because it got coined, it's created a mentality that there's finance and there's transition finance. In our view, all finance needs to be transition finance. And within that, you can think about business models that are aligning to net zero. In our view, that should be consistent with the 1.5 degree scenario. You've got business models that need to have a managed phase out. And then you've got business models that are coming up with innovative solutions. Those are really the 3 areas. Mm-hmm. And even within that frame, I think there's 2 more pitfalls. One of them is that within the idea of aligning, I think people very quickly jump to sectors and start assuming that whole sectors are either in or out. Mm. What we find when you do the kind of carbon accounting work is that it's about business models, not sectors. And the question we need to ask is not, where is the business model today? It's where could the business model be? Mm. And what you find when you do that work is some really interesting business models bubble up that you might think are transition fit and aren't. And likewise, some business models in oil and gas sectors actually prove to be very interesting investments where you could actually bring them very much into line with net zero. Just to give two examples. Long duration energy storage, which is one of the key issues we need to solve, because when we talk about renewables now being cheaper than fossil fuels in some ways, we're sometimes not taking into account the fact that the sun doesn't always shine. And actually the cost of storage quite often needs to be paired with renewable cost, and that leads to a greater number. So we have to solve long duration energy storage. There are some really interesting business models that can make use of coal sites and actually not only reuse the infrastructure, but because there's a grid interconnector already there, you're kind of good to go. So that would be an interesting example of an oil and gas business model that could convert. And then also there are cases where you could take existing oil and gas plants and turn them into solar or wind farms, again, using grid interconnectors. There's lots of other examples, but I think the key message is business model, not sector, and where can it get to, not where is it today. The only other pitfall I just want to comment on is in relation to climate solutions. So I talked about this third category, which is where you've got innovation that is coming up with new business models, new ways of doing things. That's everything from green steel through to really interesting enhanced geothermal, for example. And in those cases, not all solutions are created equal. That's the other, I think, issue we need to be talking about. Today, if you think about something like offshore wind, it's renewable, and so it gets grouped in, it's a climate solution. But actually, the offshore wind sector in a country like the UK has already come radically down the cost curve. It's cheaper than brown forms of power. And so it's not actually a climate solution. It's just a good business opportunity already. And so in our carbon accounting method, that would be zero abatement, because you're not avoiding emissions because they wouldn't have occurred anyway. Okay. And so we have to start parsing climate solutions and looking at which ones are going to make the biggest difference in bending the global emissions curve. Because without that, we're not going to spread capital to the most critical areas.
Those are some really good points, and I think I have another pitfall that we can discuss afterwards. But I want to get to also Ifeoma, there's sort of an investor take on this question. But do you have any views on the ground of these kinds of pitfalls in net zero strategies? You can also say a few words, perhaps, about what you do.
So at Cross-Boundary Energy, we pretty much position ourselves as a distributed energy resource company. So this means that we're technology agnostic. We're open to supporting our clients. And so what we found is that being in the DFI pool, we automatically have to exclude certain companies. And even as a service provider, it's somewhat sad that you have to tell some people no, especially when they're in the category of being high emitters. So we've had instances where even coal mines have approached us and we're like, no, we can't do it because it's not within our investment mandate. And so the pitfall there is, in my view, we're excluding a number of people, of companies, private sector businesses that could perhaps bring about significant changes or shifts in this transition journey. And we are disregarding them from the perspective of they are dirty. And that's why I really like the topic as well, being dirty. But for you to get to where we need to get to, you need to get your hands dirty, and that's the honest truth. And so the pitfalls that we've seen there is just making those trade-offs, like how to proceed. And I really like what you said, Clara, around business model versus the actual sector. Because when you look at the business model, there's actually a strong desire and inclination for all these companies to want to make that shift. For example, a number of our portfolio companies are now in the mining sector, and we've seen a significant shift in volume of clients coming our way because they want support along those lines. But it's not just about pushing for it, it's about providing the right support for it. Because if it's not done well, then the end result, there wouldn't amount to much. So it's very important that we have that thought process as we make those supports in place. Just to bring this down a little bit, I think you mentioned something along the lines of development as well, right? So if you were to look at it from an African context, I think there needs to be a lot of alignment between how we look at net zero goals and the current energy landscape in most of these locations. I really like what the minister said about having those bespoke solutions available, because it's not possible to make the kind of change that we need to make if you disregard what is the bread and butter of the countries or local areas that you're in. And so it'll be a good approach to have more of a two-pronged of short-term, long-term, and then see how we can marry them so that it brings about the right change and we see success from a development front in terms of economic growth, but then also the kind of transition that we're looking for to hit 1.5 degrees by 2050. Yeah.
Because one other possible pitfall that I can see on the other side is that transition finance, that term is being used as an excuse to continue business as usual. That we're just like, okay, we'll put this stamp on it, and then we can continue our oil and gas business or whatever, and preventing then other solutions to come online. I don't know how can we make sure that transition finance that is actually transitioning and not just greenwashing? Any of you?
I'm happy to start, but please come in. I mean, again, I think it goes back to where are they today, and then where are they going to get to? They need to have a plan. And this is not a nebulous idea. There's been a transition plan task force to create a standard for how you write a transition plan, which, by the way, I would love the DFIs to really lean into. I think that there's a conversation that's been going on in the institutional investor community, and I keep saying this should be an investor-wide conversation, public and private. We should have it together. But a transition plan is where it starts. You know, with scenario analysis and saying this is what we need to transition this business model. And what that will flush out is if you take, I mentioned green steel, if you take the steel sector, the assets that some of the incumbent steel players have are literally in the wrong place. So a lot of green steel plants are near reliable sources of coke and coal because that's what you need. Actually, green steel, and I say this with some trepidation because we're building the world's first green steel plant right now. It's a huge endeavor in northern Sweden. And it requires green hydrogen, electrolysis, and an electric arc furnace. And that gets you to about 94% decarbonized steel, which we think is probably as far as we can go with steel. But that's enough. And if you compare that to what a legacy kind of incumbent business could do in the steel industry if they're near reliable coke and coal, they could probably only do the electric arc furnace bit. And that's only 40% because they don't have very cheap, very reliable, abundant renewable energy, which is what you need for green hydrogen and electrolysis. And so there are just some business models that are going to find the transition really hard. Yeah. And that all becomes clear when you're forced to transition plan. And so I think that for me would be the big message, that we need to have a more honest conversation about this so that the greenwashing just can't happen because you've got a fact base.
Yeah. Have you made any thoughts on how to address this dilemma, Ifeoma?
It's an ongoing conversation as well. I think the good thing is there's a willingness. So when I mean willingness, like when we look at clients, they are not just looking at what they're going to do today. It's more or less how it's going to impact the long run. So I'll use mining sector as an example. It currently contributes about 4% of the global GHG emissions, but that's only scope 1 and 2. Scope 3, it's pretty much times 6 of that, easily times 6, times 8 of that. And that's pretty much where electrification is needed, like right now. But the thing is, there's no plan. There's no, like, people don't have an idea of what to start with first. Do I start with my fleet? Do I start with my long haulage? How do I go about it? And so there needs to be more like concerted effort in bringing about like more like ideas around how they can foster that ecosystem to not just support the capacity building required, but also like the technology that's required to make that change. What we've seen as well is from a planning perspective, when we go in, we partner with a business, not just to reduce or introduce renewable energy solutions that are just about 20%. We want to push that needle a bit more. We want to look at 40%, 70%. We currently have portfolio companies that are at the 80% mark now in terms of RE being injected in their operations. And it just shows that there's a lot more that we can do when we have the right plan and when we have the right procedures in place. And so there needs to be more conversation around how can transition finance be carefully targeted to these sectors so that we can meet the results that we are looking for.
And I think you're both sort of touching on it, that sometimes some of the sectors perhaps cannot transition. And that's the third element that I'd like to get to, is that Let's imagine an investment opportunity that where you, in the short term, you can reduce emissions, for instance, by electrification quite significantly, so some short-term gains. But if you look at the 2050, the longer picture, this kind of business model or technology or company shouldn't exist. So I'd like to turn to you, Ifeoma, since you're in the electrification business, but where do you draw the line? And have you come across any such dilemmas? I think you talked about in the mining industry, and then how did you deal with it?
So for us, it's important that we preserve the reputation of not just ourselves, but also our investors. And so we align with the mandate. And number one, we don't do any coal, even if it's coal-related activities. And as I mentioned earlier, we've had interactions with some of these companies, and we've had to turn them down based on the fact that we couldn't do the deal.
What kinds of companies were?
So coal mines especially. So what we try to do is we navigate this reputational risk especially by applying like a very a deep dive lens on the operations. We want to know where everything is going and where everything is coming from. And it's a bit unusual for them, as you can imagine, from an ESG standpoint. It's things that they haven't really interacted with before now, and so they find it very strange. And I like also what was mentioned earlier about the administrative burden. It becomes really cumbersome. You make a lot of expenses, you do DDs, you have that being done from that angle. But if I may, in my view, again, this is where planning comes in. If you're looking at hitting net zero in the time frame that we've set for ourselves, there needs to be more of like a short-term measures and then long-term approach or long-term plan as to how that would come about. Short-term could be that we look at these high emitters as low-hanging fruits, ring-fence it from a reputational standpoint, and let it be that you're focusing more on the reduction in the short term. And then over that time, you seek, as we mentioned earlier, around phasing it out, how we seek to phase it out. If we're being honest with ourselves, it's going to be here for quite a bit more time than we would like. And so it's important that we get in early and start making those changes rather than do it now rather than later. And it's businesses like ours that have the ideas of how to go about this and helping them find the right hybrid or right process we can inject them and then make those tweaks slowly but incrementally so that we get to the end.
Yeah. Clara, do you think there are any companies, sectors that we shouldn't transition, that we shouldn't electrify?
So whenever you make a capital allocation choice, you're choosing not to do something as well. Yeah. And the way that we look at it, and we're pretty strict about it, we do a lot of research and then we do draw lines, is if you have a business that let's take a business that might mend methane cracks in oil and gas pipes as a really stark example. It's true because of the toxicity of methane, that in terms of absolute abatement is very impactful in the coming few years. But you are entrenching a system which is fundamentally not consistent with a 1.5 degree world. And so it makes it, in our view, very difficult to do it, whereas there are much more nuanced cases where actually you see a pathway to 1.5 for a given type of business model, but perhaps one element of it is not actually scalable in a sustainable way. So think of sustainable aviation fuel, one of the really hard solutions to crack. Yeah. We look at business models there where we actually don't think that the use of biomass is fundamentally scalable. But the cost down in the technology that you could achieve if you used a particular biomass for, say, 5 years and then swapped it for a second generation ethanol would mean that actually you get that cost down ready, then the second generation ethanol comes in, and then it's scalable. So sometimes the sophisticated conversation is about the sequencing, again, rather than blanket rules about we don't do this or we don't do that. Yep. It does require a lot of thought, which I think is what you were saying.
Okay, and I see that we're running out of time, but I have another important topic that I want to touch upon. So as I said, we want to take on some potential high-emitting assets in our portfolio, but how can we, as a minority equity investor, how can we drive that needed transition? I mean, you mentioned the transition plans, but what kinds of tools would you think, or would you advise against it, or?
I would say, you need to get in there first. I think that's the number one thing. what we've seen happen with our portfolio is that we have, as I mentioned, we've positioned ourselves as partners for transitioning, like moving you from dirty fuel to clean energy. And that really helps in building trust. I know we've talked about partnerships as well a lot on this platform today. The partnerships also extend to how you relate with your portfolio companies. And we do a lot of the rigorous screenings. We do a lot of assessing what the model is, what the long-term plans are. And then we plug ourselves like a Lego brick, really. Just plug yourself in and be that bridge. And that's why access to capital is critical. Having the right team, the right expertise is critical. Having the right technology is also very important. But all of these things, they cumulatively come and form a part of how that should come about.
Yep.
We have a few.
Okay, I have two requests of everyone here.
Yeah.
The first one is I really want the institutional investment community and the development finance community to be having one conversation about transition finance. And as part of that, my plea is that you in particular, as investors that straddle both the private world and government, can help with country transition plans. We've been talking about corporate transition plans a lot on this panel. For the capital markets to play the role it needs to play, we need country-level transition plans. The signaling effect of that would be extraordinary, but a critical part of almost every country transition plan is going to be the role of private finance. Yep. And we need you guys to lean into that conversation and help us all so that we can get this right. The only final message I wanted to send is we are out of time, and we need to be really bold. And I really hope that we can come together as private investment community and DFIs and start to do some creative things together that are perhaps a step change. Maybe move from a kind of crowding in mindset to a partnership mindset from day one and create some different structures, because the trillions that we need to unlock, they're going to have to come from the private market. And so we have to do something different, because if you look at the allocations of pension funds today, I mean, it's extraordinary. It's such a tiny fraction of their asset base that's going to emerging markets, and we have to change that.
That's a super final remark to this panel conversation. I think because we're out of time, both in the real world and on the stage here. Thank you so much for the conversation.